Thank you so much. So I have a lot of people to thank to start because I think this is the third time that I've been invited to Glasgow to give a talk. I'm obviously in London, not in Glasgow right now, but each of the previous times the talk was canceled because of industrial action. I just want to thank Carl, Simon, Irini, Steve, Christina. Sorry if I left someone else out who's invited me, but I want to thank you for those invitations, but I also want to thank you all for canceling those talks. I think that's really important and really respectful in solidarity with UCU and all of that. Also want to thank someone else at Glasgow, Kay Dickinson, who I think is here. Kay's been really, really important to this project intellectually, but also kind of providing other kinds of support and encouragement for it. So thank you to Kay. And yeah, hopefully I can get up to Glasgow at some point and meet all of you I haven't met in person. That'll be fantastic. The talk I'm going to be giving today is, I've joked about, I've said I'm going to read the introduction to my book until Steve tells me to stop. I'm not actually going to do that. I will be reading quite a bit from the introduction. I'm going to be trying out a couple of new things as I look at revising this book. I'm not going to tell you the new stuff. I'll let you guess, but it will probably be the times when I mess up words or I realize that there's a typo or something like that. So great. I think just looking at the participant list, I can see a few of you were in the room at Historical Materialism this past weekend when I gave an eerily similar talk. This is an expanded version of that, but there will be some kind of stuff that's kind of replicated from that. And I've also engineered this talk to kind of respond to some of the feedback that I got, which is really great. Okay, so let's go ahead and get started. Just a quick warning, the first 3 or 4 minutes, there's a lot of political economy and history. So if you're here for the art, just bear with me through all that stuff. Okay, great. Okay, fantastic. Since the end of, actually, let's go to the first slide. The logistical mode of art. My talk's gonna be in 3 parts, by the way. First part, the logistical mode of art. Since the end of World War II, the capitalist world system has become increasingly logistical. So too has the world of art. With the staggering rise of a global art market and gallery system, more paintings, more sculptures, more performances circulate the globe than ever before, and with an intensity unimaginable even a half-century ago. Art might not be a commodity like any other, but it certainly can move like one. The connection of art to logistics extends beyond the scale of its circulation. Circulation has become a factor in the very production of art itself, dictating and delimiting what gets made and how, but also providing artists with methods and materials to use. I think my email is going to be going off throughout this talk, but that's fine. That'll be fun. Okay. From post-war performance experiments that task participants with moving objects to the more recent trend of shipping container architecture, the very production of art has become tangled up in the circulatory techniques and technologies of logistics. Logistics originated as a military term some 200 years ago to recognize how victory on the 19th century battlefield hinged as much on the strategizing of generals as it did with keeping armies supplied with food and munitions. Logistical thought seized hold of American boardrooms in the 1950s, taking the form of corporate plans to increase profitability by consolidating and cutting down on the cost for transporting and storing goods. What parades today in business schools as a management science for getting the right thing to the right place at the right time is better described as the infrastructural reason why the supply chain now supersedes the factory as the exemplary organizational form of capitalist production. Today, the manufacturing of commodities tends to be spread across a disaggregated system of production sites, flexibly arranged according to the goal of lowering total costs. Restructuring capitalist production in such a way required building out a global physical and information infrastructure for moving commodities, one that's made of everything from megaports and distribution centers to barcodes and RFID tags. During what Robert Brenner calls the long downturn of flagging productivity growth rates, a period we're still in, Logistical restructuring helped to lift profits overall, expanding the supply pipeline to decrease the turnover time of capital while increasing the volume of goods flowing within it. Logistical restructuring has also boosted the agility of firms, allowing them to shift production sites and manufacturing lines according to volatility, be it in markets or in workplaces. Expanded economies of scale and enhanced flexibility. These are the benefits that the logistics industry praises itself most publicly for delivering. But as many critics have argued, logistics is first and foremost labor market arbitrage enacted through circulation. Primarily by means of mechanizing and disciplining logistics work, the logistics infrastructure has boosted labor productivity in the sphere of commodity circulation. The plummeting price for circulating goods has made it cost-effective for capital to scour the world for cheap labor power, otherwise known as workers, to make commodities often far from where they will be consumed at the end of the chain. The logistics infrastructure may have helped to reshape the capitalist production process, but it has only bolstered the imperial ambitions of a deepening capitalist world system that continues to rely on unbridled resource extraction, land dispossession, and environmental destruction, the consequences of which are unevenly dispersed to the periphery, where they are burdened out onto racialized surplus populations. Now for some art. As capitalism has become newly logistical, art has followed suit, and in some cases even helped to pave the way. Consider, for example, Walid Beshti, who in 2007, strapped for cash but needing to create work for an exhibition in Berlin, requisitioned his gallery's FedEx account and began a project of shipping laminated shatterproof glass cubes made to fit the dimensions of standardized FedEx boxes. When exhibited, the sculptures are shown shorn of their packaging, the cracks in chipped glass becoming a record of transit, as if a company hired to move something by Donald Judd had fucked up the job. The wear and tear of circulation on full display in FedEx works is a pristine example of what I call the logistical mode of art, wherein techniques and technologies designed to move capitalist commodities are retooled to make art. This mode is logistical insofar as it foregrounds an integral role of circulation in artistic production, analogous to the way that capitalist production over the past half century has been increasingly shaped by circulation considerations. Yet the logistical connection between art and capitalist production is often more than just analogy. Art that operates in the logistical mode has had a hand, however slight, in shaping the circulation techniques and technologies available to capital for moving commodities. And that's what I'm going to try to prove today and in my book. There's no shortage of criticism and theory on the connection of art and logistics. Most writers examine how logistics infrastructure, like pipelines or ports, are depicted in things like film, photography, television, and the like. The best of this writing searches the sphere of aesthetic production for telltale ideological symptoms or even potential cognitive maps that might help us orient ourselves to a Disneying world upturned by the offshoring of production. With rare exceptions, however, few have sought to take seriously the role that art has played in shaping these very logistics infrastructures. Oops. A film critic, for instance, might observe with bemusement the fact that the climactic battle scene in Iron Man 3 unfolds in a container yard, but not think to ask how business in the port of Wilmington, North Carolina, was impacted by shooting the scene on location. No gantry cranes were harmed in the filming of Iron Man 3. That's the one joke I'm going to make in this talk, I promise. Instead of examining how art represents logistics infrastructure, I focus on what art made from actual logistics technologies can tell us about the history, present state, and future role of circulation in capitalist production. To put it simply, my book, Arts of Logistics, tries to figure out why it is that so much art, since around 1945, has been made out of or with things like merchant ships, oil barrels, shipping containers, drones, freight trucks, and more. Most artists who work in the logistical mode use tools and technologies for moving commodities, not to comment on or critique logistics infrastructure, let alone to sabotage or block them. Artists typically do so for more practical or opportunistic reasons, be it because oil barrels and shipping containers are cheap and easy to obtain, or because logistics companies offer them commissions to work with the robot technology, as in the case with Cirque du Soleil and Amazon, or because logistic companies offer artists opportunities to sail aboard their container ships. The ways in which artists are embedded and tangled up in logistics are many, and for better or worse, so too are the lessons that can be learned from their art. That artistic production might rely materially on technologies designed to circulate commodities is nothing new. At the dawn of the capitalist world system, in the proto-capitalist merchant power of 15th century Venice, for example, canvas sailcloth became a default material for painters, useful because it was in plenty, but also because it made paintings relatively easy to move. At the high water mark of the British Empire in the 19th century, the spectacular sets of London theaters literally relied on sturdy ropes bought from local ship chandlers. This is a Glasgow theater, that's my theater reference. In this talk, the rest is mostly art and performance. Logistics also has origins that precedes its so-called revolution in the 1960s. The early modern commerce of city-states like Venice and the transatlantic slave trade driven by the British are but two examples that helped establish key technologies, trade routes, and calculative logics that reduce anything to cargo, people included. Logistics might not be new to either art or capitalism, but the significance of logistics infrastructure in both has intensified qualitatively since the Second World War. Historically, logistical coordination could be said to have operated in trade and commodity circulation of many kinds, not just those that have been hitched to the historical world system of capital. Though much of this was oriented to a mercantilist logic of buy cheap, sell dear, rather than properly capitalist imperatives of increasing labor productivity or accelerating the turnover time of capital. What distinguishes our logistical present from the presence of logistics in the past is that today, the capitalist process for producing commodities tends to be subordinated to considerations related to what is entailed to circulate these commodities. Rather than an afterthought to production, circulation has been vying to take the lead. Scholars often date the so-called revolution in logistics to the late 1950s or 1960s, a time when the likes of Peter Drucker declared logistics to be the, quote, last dark continent of American business, when the containerization of trade got underway through the American War in Vietnam, when wrangling over the Suez Canal rejigged the paths of world commerce and catalyzed the growth of enormous carriers and container ships, and when a dock workers union on the west coast of the United States signed a landmark 1960 agreement with employers affirming what they called, quote, the rule of unnecessary men. In exchange for work and wage guarantees for a small swath of veteran longshoremen, and at the expense of most other longshoremen, especially young and Black workers, the International Longshore and Warehouse Workers Union agreed that there would be no unnecessary men in the docks, a commitment that allowed shippers to begin overhauling the waterfront workplace by replacing many workers with labor-saving technologies, like the shipping container, and disciplining the work of those who remained. Here was the first stitch in the pattern of mechanization and modernization that would quickly blanket logistics work across the world of capital. Just months later, in August 1961, two Paris-based artists, Christo and Jean-Claude, paid a group of dock workers in Cologne to build them a few sculptures made of oil barrels and industrial rolls of paper that were overdue to be shipped. The result would be dockside packages, one of the most iconic works of art of the post-war period, praised as a challenge to what art could be, where it could be made, and who could be enlisted to make it. Read from a different perspective, that of capital, the challenge that Christo and Jean-Claude posed to art could be just as easily be understood as a challenge to the state of logistics work. That a pair of artists could, on a whim, second idling dock workers to create art would have seemed to be evidence supporting the insistence of shippers that there were unnecessary men wasting time while employed on waterfronts around the world. This included the port of Cologne, which by 1961 was already being consolidated and moved upriver. The gallery that Christo and Jean-Claude were in town to exhibit at participated in this very transformation, having just opened on the waterfront as part of the transformation of the docklands. Just a handful of years later, the pair intensified their logistical embeddedness when they started working in 1966 with a small Dutch packaging company called Janus Vatten to create an outdoor sculpture made of oil barrels for a private collector. This started a 4-decade-long collaboration, during which time both the artist and Janus Vatten grew into giants of their respective industries, art and logistics. That art may have participated in the logistical restructuring of the capitalist world system has, probably for good reason, largely been ignored, not just in histories of logistics, but also in histories of art. And even by those scholars who have sought to account for effects of the restructuring of global capital on aesthetic form. The story often told about art of the long downturn goes something like this. The dematerialization of the art object coincided with the rise of service work and financialized assets in deindustrializing countries. Just as performance and conceptual art became newly prominent in the world of art, so too was the world of work, increasingly filled with service jobs that resembled performance and banks with investment opportunities for speculation. As an account of political economy over the past half-century, this story is both true and incomplete. Among other things, it fails to consider how the reshaping of work in deindustrial economies was not just defined by the rise of jobs in the service sector and a surge in financialization. It relied on logistical restructuring. We can see some of the limits in this explanation by revisiting the very performance that is most often presented as exemplifying the deindustrial shift to a financialized service economy. Alan Capro's 1967 happening Fluids. For the likes of Helen Molesworth, Jasper Burns, Hal Foster, not to mention Jack Burnham before them and others, Fluids literally put the art object's dematerialization on display. It involved participants building large rectangular structures from blocks of ice, which when completed were left to melt in the Southern California sun. According to Jasper Burns, as the manufacturer building liquefied, the artwork shifted into the realm of service, becoming the means for the production of an experience. Let's dwell, however, for a moment on the frozen water used in Fluids, whose very ephemerality Burns insists makes this a transitional work. This quality of ice, the fact that it melts, also makes it a supremely logistical commodity, notoriously tricky to transport and store, for obvious reasons. Before ice could be industrially manufactured, it had to be extracted, moved, and stored, presenting several logistical complications whose solutions propelled crucial advances in shipping and warehousing. For a time, ice was one of the most harvested crops by weight transported by train or ship in the United States, second only to cotton. And like cotton, ice was a commodity of empire, typically moved along colonial trade routes from North America and Northern Europe to the West Indies and India. The logistical demands of ice shaped Fluids in many ways. The happening itself was an enormous undertaking, unfolding not just once, as many accounts say, but in 15 different outdoor locations across Los Angeles over 3 days. Each large structure required 650 blocks to build, which meant sourcing 405,000 pounds of frozen water from the Union Ice Company, one of the leaders of the ice industry. Timing was key to making Fluids, since a slow work of building had to be balanced by how quickly the ice would melt. Deliveries had to be many, arranged for every 2 hours. The logistical need for time deliveries broadens the portraits of the kinds of work and workers Fluids required. Alongside art school volunteers, there were truck drivers paid a wage for their deliveries. For Burns and others to present the shift to a service economy as the context for Fluids is not wrong, but it leaves out the enabling role of logistical work. The discourse around Fluids thus exemplifies a tendency of scholars interested in art of the long downturn to look past logistics. In addition to artists who sought to dematerialize the art object, Many artists also made art by moving objects, often working with trucking and delivery firms to do so. Capro himself is an exemplar of this. A striking percentage of his work in the 1960s tasked participants with moving stuff, from furniture to people. The most frequently used object in his inventory were oil barrels, which he found on streets, rescued from dumps, but most often borrowed from packaging and petrochemical firms. Capro was also particularly attuned to the logistical shifts underway in society. He read much of the same systems and cybernetic theorists as logisticians, and even wrote essays that celebrated how capital was poised to solve problems in the sphere of production through automation, leaving the problems that remained ones of, as he put it, distribution. It goes without saying that he showed little understanding that much of what he called drudgery work in factories was in the process not of being automated out of existence, but offshored to be taken up by others earning an impossibly lower wage. Capro, Christo, and Jean-Claude were hardly alone in their interest in and engagement with logistics. We might read many conceptual art experiments with things like mail or telephones, not simply as attempts at communicating information, as the likes of CN9 and Pamela Lee have argued, but as being done for a variety of purposes, often to arrange the movement of things or to simply explore new infrastructures for moving things. This is the third and final part. The logisticality of art has become even more pronounced in recent decades, as artists salvage cargo ships to build sculptures, convert shipping containers into galleries, and collaborate with robotics companies to show off technology designed to streamline delivery work. Annika Yee's recent Tate Modern installation is a case in point. She transformed the turbine hall into an enormous aquarium, populated by large floating drones drifting in real time, their course set by an artificial intelligence system. In Love with the World was celebrated as a transdisciplinary project that brought together partners ranging from microbiologists and engineers to anthropologists and perfumers. The real-time location technology system that her drones relied on was provided by POSIX, a Ghent-based logistics technology firm whose primary business involves using these same systems for what they call warehouse optimization, marketing their AI and robotics technology as solutions to improve what they call labor and efficiency, material flow, and yes, that term, lean manufacturing. POSIX is, in other words, part of an entire emerging industry devoted to automating distribution centers. The number of artists and architects propping up the increasingly lucrative market for secondhand shipping containers, which surpassed 1 million in 2016 and has expanded since, is another even more obvious case in point of the entanglement of arts in logistics. The creative reuse of containers as touring mini theaters or pop-up galleries helps companies like Maersk, who has an entire business dedicated just to secondhand container sales. It helps them cut their losses on expired equipment. The idea that art might provide certain supports for logistics suggests certain problems that go beyond what is often considered when critics focus solely on matters of how art represents logistics. This includes the dangers of what Alberto Toscano and Jeff Kinkle have called the logistical sublime, such as we might find in popular landscape port photography, such as by artists Frank Brewer and Edward Batinsky. Images like this attest to the enormity of containerization, but through its sprawling spectacle of order, evince a heartening sense of permanence and rationality, reassuring viewers that they are either in good or omnipotent hands. An image like this is an opportunity, Toscano and Kinkle argue, it's an opportunity to relish in being bewildered. In response to such art, Toscano and Kinkle and many others endorse Frederick Jameson's prescription for cognitive mapping, an aesthetic means that might be appropriate for helping one find their way through the morass of what Deb Cowan calls logistic space, and thus gain what Jameson called a situational representation of the capitalist world system, one that might be politically useful, if not empowering. I'm somewhat ambivalent on this, and you'll hear that in a second. The examples of artists working in the logistical mode that provide an example of such mapping are many. For the sake of time, I'm going to briefly introduce a handful of artists who make work by directly engaging what's called third-party logistics, or 3PL. This includes firms like DHL and UPS and so forth. 3PL is a growing logistics industry subsector currently valued at $1 trillion. In addition to Beshti's work with FedEx mentioned earlier, there's Rohaleh Filsufi, who in 2016 started shipping ceramic vessels from the US to Iran via USPS, and then exhibiting the often shattered and shipped results. Or consider the work of Lydia Oramain, who across several projects has tried and typically failed to ship all manner of things across borders, purposely violating post-colonial laws designed to prevent neo-colonial pillaging. This has included mud from the Nile River she tried to send via FedEx to Chicago, a half-ton of fertile soil, 20 empty oil barrels, all of which sourced from Algeria, and she tried to send to Switzerland and England, respectively. Perhaps most famous is Michael Rakowitz, who in 2004 opened an import-export business in Brooklyn, claiming it to be an art project and using it to effectively restart the trade of dates from Iraq, which had been banned for decades because of sanctions. After many disastrous false starts, Rakowitz ended up turning to DHL for help, who is operating in the war-torn country on behalf of the American military. And then there's Audubon Nkanga, who in 2007 flew to Nigeria with sand gathered from the Netherlands, which she then exchanged with sand gathered from a beach near Lagos, shipping it back to the Netherlands. This was a re-performance of an Alan Cowper happening from 1972. The Nigerian-born artist, this time swapping UPS for DHL and shifting the location from Texas to a Dutch colonial trade route. Each of these artists in their own ways use 3PL firms for the purpose of mapping the logistic space of borders, restrictions, and histories of empire. But cognitive mapping provides nothing like a silver bullet. Such work also often comes with limits and strings attached. Here, it might be useful to return to Beshti's FedEx works. Most critics have described this series as continuing the long history of artists revealing the hidden infrastructures of the art institution. In this case, putting the spotlight on the industry of art handling with its lucrative combination of insurance, registration, security, transit, and more. This may be true, but Beshti has also made no secret that this work has something to do with FedEx. Founded in Arkansas in 1971, FedEx is one of the world's largest courier companies, with $104 billion in revenue in 2020. It is also a major government contractor, handling, among other things, military logistics for the United States. Its 3PL arm, FedEx Supply Chain, is one of the world's largest. With 130 warehouses and distribution centers in North America alone, FedEx occupies some 35 million square feet, and its operations have made the Memphis airport second in the world for cargo, behind only Hong Kong. In his own writing about FedEx works, Beshti registers another example of FedEx's colonization of space, explaining how the company has copyrighted the exact volumes and dimensions of its shipping boxes. The sculptures he creates fit the exact dimensions of these FedEx boxes, and when displayed, Beshti stipulates that they be shown alongside or on top of the box in which they are shipped, with tape and accrued labels and all included. In his voluminous writing about his own work, Beshti explains that FedEx secured legal rights on particular dimensions from the International Standards Organization, GS1. Beshti also tells us that GS1 is best known for bringing the world of the barcode, that information technology so essential to global inventory management. Were we to take a computer, input all of the various competing definitions of cognitive mapping that have been pitched since Jameson coined the term some 40 years ago, and then ask a computer to 3D print an exemplar of an art of cognitive mapping, I imagine there's a decent chance it would look something like FedEx works. This piece aspires to have a kind of mapping function, though maybe too literally or materially. Each time one of the sculptures moves, it is packed back in its box and the title changes. With each new shipment, Beshti adds onto the title the new destination, mode of shipping, tracking number, and date of movement. And this creates like giant, really, really long titles, as you can imagine. Thus, in the title, we have a record of every single movement the box has ever made. And through the visible wear and tear, we even get to see the results of what happened to it along the way. We get a lot of information from FedEx Works, but little of which we can do much with. The focus is so much on the trees that we are left with zero sense of the forest in which we're in. Of course, the project is meant to be a prompt to teach us things about FedEx, its copyright on space, the workings of international standard organizations like GS1. But we don't need an artist to teach us any of this. Wikipedia might work just fine. Still, I'm drawn to this work since it puts on display a certain truth the infrastructure it uses was built to tell. Damage, not flow, as being the logistical status quo. And I'm going to finish with something new, really, really quick. There's a final point about Beshti, one that has to do with me and my own potential embeddedness in the logistical mode of art, as a result of me having written a book called Arts of Logistics. And here it is. Beshti is well known among art critics to be of a theory-savvy generation of artists who are extremely entrenched, not just in the gallery system, but also in the critical art discourse that has become a significant infrastructure for legitimating and supporting this very gallery system. Beshti, to put it bluntly, knows what critics like me might want to see. And I'm not the first one to say this about his work. It will not be news to anyone, I don't think, that the recursive relationship between art and theory or criticism today has become a means not just of legitimating art, but also helping it to circulate on the global art market and through the global gallery system. When a high-profile critic like Nicholas Boyle praises FedEx Works as an exemplar of cognitive mapping, as he has done, Boyle is literally helping to guarantee the circulation of Beshti's FedEx Works. Boyle's critical appraisal becomes one means for allowing this work to travel the globe. I'm no Nicholas Boyle. I have no desire to be a Nicholas Boyle, and I will leave it there. Thank you.